Okay, let's go ahead and start. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those that are joining us in India. I want to welcome you to this town hall on caste and tech. We are so excited to have you guys join Equality Labs, as well as the Harvard Center for South Asian Studies, coworker.org, and Data and Society for this unique conversation as we do a deep dive today about how to better understand what the system of caste is, how it operates as a system of discrimination in the United States, but also how we're seeing it manifest in the tech industry. And of course, while many caste-oppressed Americans have been talking about the issue of caste discrimination in the US for a long time, much of this conversation really exploded onto the national landscape with the historic lawsuit that the state of California has brought against the company of Cisco. And I think that case has not only inspired a whole new wave of Dalit Americans to speak out about this issue, but we're finally seeing movement on many different institutional fronts to add caste as a protected category and have a better understanding of how we should be adding it to many of our diversity and inclusion measures across many institutions, not just tech. So we look forward to the conversation today. And, you know, as you guys know, in terms of many of our Equality Labs events, we are always looking at ways that we can provoke an intersectional dialogue and really ask folks to kind of carry a level of, curiosity and empathy, but also deep inquiry in some of the comments as you engage with our speakers and this topic today. I also think what's really important is that, and I really just want to shout out that there are many worker organizers who have come to the town hall today. And I really want to shout out the folks, who are coming from the different coworker.org pods, as well as folks that are here from Googlers Against Racism. I think it's really important to see the ways that workers grapple with this issue. And we're really excited and hope this town hall will be the beginning of a really powerful material conversation that helps to move this into structural changes at our institutions. And this becomes really interesting when we're talking about, caste discrimination in tech firms, because we see caste manifest in so many different aspects of the technological sector, whether it's in recruitment, hiring, workplace dynamics, sexual harassment, the limitation of our HR policies, and the general lack of understanding of what explicit and implicit bias looks like along caste lines really has kind of created a real boiling point for caste oppressed employees who are in casteist workplaces. And so I think today's conversation will help us really get a better understanding about this problem, but how we can really work towards our solution. And before I go into a little brief introduction into caste, I just wanted to introduce our powerful panelists today. So joining us, we have first Maya Kamble, who's from the Ambedkar Association of North America. She is one of the first Dalit women computer scientists and has really excelled both in the fields of tech and human rights, and is now her own entrepreneur of her own company. We also have Ajanta Subramaniam, who is professor of Anthropology and South Asian Studies at Harvard University. Her research focus includes political economy, political ecology, colonialism, post-colonialism, but also quite critically, the focus of how caste gets developed within the technology sector, particularly in the Indian Institutes of Technology. So we'll be hearing from her, which I think will be very interesting. We also have Sam Cornelius, who is co-founder of Ambedkar International Center. And Sam is an incredible technologist who has worked at multiple multinational corporations, both in India and in the US, including Cisco. And Sam has a very powerful analysis about how some of his experiences of casteist workplaces were very critical to his own organizing as an Ambedkarite organizer in the diaspora. We also have joining us Sareeta Amrute, who is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Washington. And she's also the director of research at the Data and Society Research Institute. For all of our family at Data and Society, thank you so much for joining us. Like, we love you guys, and it's really a powerful thing to co-host this session with you. Sareeta's research interests also include immigration and racial capitalism in the global tech industry, as well as social movement building through data, narrative, and affect. She's the author of Encoding Race, Encoding Class, Indian IT Workers in Berlin, and she'll be joining us today to talk a lot of how the H-1B visa is a critical access both in limiting worker power, but also the ways workers think and work around that limitation. And then finally, we have with us Anil Dash, CEO of Glitch and Movement Technologist. Anil Dash, as a CEO of Glitch, has really created a company that's a friendly developer community to help create web apps. But he's also recognized as one of the technology industry's staunchest advocates for a more humane and inclusive and ethical tech through his work as an entrepreneur, activist, and writer, but also advocate in terms of racial justice issues, and also working with other caste oppressed people to start to explore and talk about the issues of caste oppression in the industry. So I really appreciate all of our panelists for being here, and I think it's time for us to just start digging in. All right then, so let me just go ahead and share my screen. Give me a moment. And again, as always, like, we also have closed caption, and want to shout out our captioner, Amanda, who is here, as well as our folks that are online on Facebook. Please, again, chat your comments in. So I think one of the things I wanted to just start right off the bat, in terms of talking about, whoops, let me just present this, okay. So in terms of talking about caste, I think sometimes there's just a huge level of confusion about what caste is, does it even exist today, and how to address it the way that we address other protected categories. And I think a lot of it has to do with miseducation and people being unfamiliar with systems of oppression that may not have had their origin point in terms of American history. But I want to share for people that are new to this conversation, caste is the system of oppression analogous to race. It is not the same as race, but it operates in all of the structural ways that you might consider racial discrimination and racial bias. And at the core, caste is a social category that is determined at one's birth, and one's family's caste determines your spiritual purity and the caste profession that you are, committed to. And within that, your level of spiritual purity and therefore your experiences of structural access or structural discrimination, as well as proximity to violence. And I think the thing to know is that there's a lot of disinformation about caste, particularly as it's discussed in the diaspora. For a very long time, dominant caste networks tried to erase the fact that caste existed as virulently as it does in our homelands, as well as its existence in the diaspora. But, I want to assure everyone that's here on the line that caste is one of the most vicious and predatory systems of discrimination, and that every day we see 3 Dalits who are murdered, 2 who are assaulted, and 2 who are raped. That's every day. And in the context of such levels of extreme violence in our homelands, what we see is a reorganization of caste, primarily wherever South Asians are and participate in American institutions, because it is the way that we know how to relate to each other, is the recreation of this hierarchy. And for a little bit more concrete definitions, because I think particularly if you've read the Cisco case and how, what consists of a casteist workplace, I think it's really important that just like race, we need to not just talk about the consequences of a structure of oppression and the community that's impacted by it, but we also need to talk about the communities that benefit from it. And so when we're talking about caste, we often see this pyramid here. And this pyramid refers to the different castes and also their locations towards spiritual purity. So those at the top are Brahmins, and Brahmins were the creator of the Hindu scriptures that actually laid down the foundation for caste. And while caste has its origins in Hindu scripture, it is now found across all of the major South Asian religions. And so I think it's very important for us to take this conversation out of a religious or liturgical debate and really understand it within the frame of human rights. And as we go down this pyramid, in addition to the Brahmins who have the concentration of power and who, set up this system, we also have Kshatriyas who were warriors and the rulers in Indian society, Vaishyas who were like the merchants' castes, Shudras who were the peasants who did like the work labor, and then you had Dalits, or the castes that were formerly known as untouchable, who were basically pushed out of society because they were born into polluting castes, and because they were seen as pure, impure, defiling, that's actually why they were considered untouchable, because to touch them was to actually make someone else unclean. And their uncleanliness was also connected to the professions that they were forced into, which included picking up dead bodies, cleaning up the shit of other castes, even some creative professions, particularly ones that included like the skin of animal skin in the making of the instrument. And I think in understanding this, I don't think it's necessary for someone to organize in a company to have such an in-depth understanding of caste. I think what's critical to understand is that caste as a system of oppression is recognized both by national and international bodies as a protected class. And that, as much as we will see interpersonal relations of caste, where we might see caste slurs or sexual harassment around caste lines, we're also interested in the structural discrimination that comes with this. And so within the caste system, we see a concentration of resources, land, access to water, education, and employment at the top of the pyramid with the Brahmins. And then the lower we go into the pyramid, we see Dalits and other peasant castes facing an incredible amount of structural discrimination, punishing violence, and exclusion. And so this is really where we see the system when it comes into the diaspora. We start to see some of these same patterns of violence and exclusion and bias replicated in our workplaces, our religious institutions, and educational institutions. And that's some of what we are going to be talking today. And finally, before I just kind of close, what's really important to know is that Equality Labs conducted one of the first surveys of caste-based discrimination in the United States over 3 years ago. And this was the first data set that confirmed how deep the problem was in the United States. And I really just want to shout out my fellow co-author on this, Dr. Maria Maitri, because it's significant that Dalit feminists led this conversation and also conducted this research, because so much of Dalit feminist practice is really rooted in material solidarities. And part of the reasons why we asked to do this survey is because when we started to work with other feminists on issues of immigration, on issues of gender-based violence, on issues of workplace harassment and discrimination, we saw that this was such a structural problem in the US that we needed to be able to have a data set that could actually speak to its problem. And so I just want to kind of like highlight some things for organizers on this call, is that, in our survey, 1 out of 4 Dalits said that they had faced physical assault based on their caste. 1 in 3 said that they had experienced some form of educational discrimination based on their caste. 2 out of 3 said that they had been treated unfairly at their workplace. Just those top 3 statistics just blew our team away, because in every aspect we are seeing physical assault, educational, and workplace discrimination. And oftentimes when I share this data set with people, some of the first questions people will say is, "Oh, you mean like in India, right?" And I said, no. this is in the United States. And that's really why I think, one of the other, kind of startling pieces of this data for me is that 1 out of 2 Dalit respondents in our survey said they live in fear of being outed because they are concerned about the impact of their livelihood and their community relationships because of how severe it is to be out as Dalit or caste oppressed. And that's really what I would like to leave people with, is that in the context of this kind of discrimination, it's not surprising, actually, that we would see discrimination in the tech sector, particularly because the tech sector has so many South Asians, particularly Indian Americans in the sector. And so I think that's where we really need to kind of start digging in to better understand, what does this look like? And Ajantha, I think this is a great place for us to kind of dive in. And I'm wondering, a lot of the questions I've had with journalists and other organizers has really been about, how did these people get so casteist? I literally had a journalist ask me that. How did they get so casteist? I don't understand. Aren't they in America? And I think that the answer to that is that it actually starts in India, and it starts with these educational institutions where, caste capital gets turned into tech capital. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit with our audience, your perspective.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Marie, for the introduction, which kind of makes it easier for all of us to say what we need to say. So I've written out comments. I'm gonna sort of keep it as light as possible, but there's a lot to say on the question of caste capital and tech capital. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't run over. So let me just start by kind of echoing what Marie said, which is that, like with race, it's really important to think about caste as a source of both inherited disadvantage and of inherited privilege, right? And we can see this really clearly in the social makeup of the Indian American community, which is highly educated, very affluent, and overwhelmingly made up of dominant castes, right? So the inheritances of caste, and most importantly, kind of intergenerational access to education, has determined who has the means to come to the United States and succeed educationally, economically, and professionally, right? So in other words, it's important to think of caste as a filter, right? The caste stratification of Indian society has meant that the most well-regarded and competitive institutions of higher education and employment, like the IITs, continue to be majority dominant caste, right? So although there has been some shift in the social composition of some of these institutions because of caste-based affirmative action policies, what in India are called reservations, these changes have yet to make a noticeable impact on the most elite institutions, as well as on patterns of transnational migration to the United States. So at every step, caste has been a filter. So first, of which groups have access to education at all. Second, of who can succeed in elite higher education. And third, who can use higher education as a stepping stone to the United States, right? So now let me say something about how this is played out in the Indian engineering and IT sectors in particular, right? So when engineering education was first introduced into India, and this was in the British colonial period, colonial officials consciously targeted dominant castes, right? Who came from histories of literacy and education, right? And consciously sidelined oppressed castes who actually were far more skilled in technical pursuits than dominant castes, right? So the effects of this policy were clearly seen in the engineering sector, which ended up being populated by dominant castes, right? So just to give you one example of this, a particularly stark example is of the southeastern region, right? Where Tamil Brahmins, the caste that Kamala Harris's mother belonged to, Tamil Brahmins made up as much as 70% of the engineering profession. And this was despite being only 3% of the regional population, right? So that gives you a sense of how skewed it was. So now the expansion of engineering education after independence from colonial rule did correct this extremely skewed picture to some extent, but the caste stratification of technical training remained. So the top tier engineering colleges like the IITs remained far more dominant caste in composition than lower tier engineering colleges and technical schools, which is where oppressed castes went, right? So there were more people who got access to technical education, but this didn't really correct for the stratification, right, of these institutions. Now, we've seen the rise of oppressed caste movements, and especially the demand for educational rights in the sort of past 40 years or so, right? And these have definitely resulted in some changes. So there's now, as I mentioned earlier, there's now a robust system of caste-based affirmative action in place that has changed the caste composition of technical higher education. But these changes are limited to public institutions, which means that private engineering colleges and the tech sector, where Cisco and other kind of corporate giants operate, continue to be overwhelmingly dominant caste and a hostile work environment for oppressed caste groups, right? So in effect, the forms of caste capital, right, that have been historically inherited and that have underwritten opportunities in both tech education and employment remain in place, right? And the IT revolution has just exacerbated the situation. So the IT sector really favors recruitment from elite public colleges like the IITs and from private colleges where there's no affirmative action, with the result that the sector is mostly dominant caste in composition, and the managerial tier of the IT sector is almost exclusively so, okay? So now I'm going to say a little bit about affirmative action and the response to affirmative action by dominant castes in India. So when the Indian government extended caste quotas to public institutions like the IITs, what happened was that faculty and students at these institutions responded with fierce opposition, right? And what's significant is that they expressed their opposition not in the name of caste, right, but in the name of protecting meritocracy. And this should be familiar to all of us in the United States, right? It's a very similar set of arguments that are made against affirmative action here, right? That one has to protect meritocracy. And the students who are admitted through these caste quotas, right, have faced routine stigmatization at these institutions. They're treated as less deserving, as less intelligent, less capable. And this kind of like everyday hostility has made life a living hell for students who get in through these reserved category, through sort of caste quotas, and especially a living hell for Dalit students, right? Who are routinely subject to these probing questions that are intended to out them as Dalits, right? And this fear of it, and this is something that then Maria already pointed to, this fear of exposure and stigma, right, has forced Dalit students to try and pass as non-Dalits, right? And when they refuse to pass, right, when they come out in public as Dalits, the scapegoating has very often led to suicides, right? And we saw this, I mean, one of the kind of most publicized instance of late of a Dalit suicide in response to scapegoating was of Rohit Vemula at the University of Hyderabad, right? So, and what is particularly perverse is that the same dominant castes who discriminate against so-called quota students are at the same time convinced of their own castelessness, okay? So they firmly believe that it is quota students who bring caste into institutions where it previously didn't exist, right? And we see this kind of expressed sort of most acutely in engineering colleges, because engineers really sort of invest in this mythology of their own castelessness, okay? Most of them believe that their academic and professional successes are due entirely to their own merit or intellect or innate abilities and have nothing to do with being long-standing beneficiaries of caste privilege, right? And even when they acknowledge forms of caste affiliation, so you might have somebody saying, oh yes, I'm Brahmin, or yes, I'm some other dominant caste. Even when they acknowledge that, they still deny that caste is a structural advantage, okay? And by contrast, they accuse oppressed caste students who have overcome extreme odds, right, who have overcome severe social obstacles to attend institutions like the IITs, they accuse them of being the illegitimate beneficiaries of caste, right? So it's become this kind of deeply held part of dominant caste common sense, of kind of dominant caste self-definition, that quota students are from intellectually and socially inferior castes, while they themselves are just meritocratic individuals, right, for whom caste doesn't really matter. Now I'm going to say a little bit about how all of this plays out in the US Indian diaspora before turning it over to my fellow panelists. So one of the ways that dominant castes have responded to kind of these increasing challenges to their caste power in India is by moving, right? So in response to the rise of oppressed caste movements, dominant castes have moved. So they've moved from countryside to the city, from public to the private sector, from region to region within India, and they've also moved from India abroad. And the specific form, this is really important, the specific form of capital that they have, which is academic and professional credentials, have made for easy exit, because this is a particularly mobile form of capital, okay? It's made for easy exit, and since this is a mobile and transferable form of capital, exit has also contributed to the further accumulation of capital, right? So this is, you see this really dramatically in the case of IIT alumni who have used their caste capital to come to the United States and to accumulate even more capital in the US tech sector, right? And so the overrepresentation in the US tech sector of alumni from the IITs and a few other select Indian institutions, as well as the Indian professional networks that play a role in university admissions and in corporate job hiring, have essentially guaranteed that there will be caste discrimination at work here, okay? And we obviously see this in the Cisco case, where the Dalit engineer from IIT was outed, right, as a quota student, and his dominant caste bosses really tried to put him in his place, right? But as Thenmuri has pointed out, and as we'll hear from other panelists, the Cisco engineer's experience is just the tip of the iceberg, right, of US casteism. But despite this reality, this kind of pervasive reality of US casteism, the only institution that has added caste to its non-discrimination policy thus far is Brandeis University, right? And this is why I think the Cisco case is so important, right? It has the potential to connect the dots. It has the potential to force the technology and the academic sectors to recognize and prevent caste-based discrimination, right? The addition of caste to corporate and university non-discrimination policies will empower oppressed caste students and employees to more openly address their experiences of discrimination, but it should also encourage dominant caste Indian Americans to be just more aware of how their own caste backgrounds have afforded them opportunities, right? So most US-born Indians are ignorant of caste privilege, right? They tend to think of India, because this is the story that they've been told by their migrant parents, they tend to think of India simply as a place of economic constraint that their parents or their grandparents had to escape in order to find real opportunity in the United States. And this blindness to caste privilege really helps to reinforce the rags to riches story of Indian American success, right? It makes Indian Americans appear as a model minority to be pitted against other minorities who are blamed for lacking the same accomplishments. And so awareness of how their own families' caste backgrounds have facilitated migration and success in the United States will hopefully help US-born Indians challenge the narratives of exceptionalism that favor them, and that favor them over and against other racial minorities, right? But I think to more comprehensively address caste discrimination, US institutions have to go beyond simply recognizing the caste backgrounds of their students or employees and monitoring social interactions, right? There needs to be a much more concerted effort to expand the scope of academic and corporate recruitment to explicitly favor underrepresented caste groups, and to recruit from lower tier engineering colleges in India, which are populated by oppressed castes, right? And I think another important step in this direction will be to classify oppressed castes, not just as underrepresented, but as an underrepresented minority within a minority in the United States. Okay. So let me just stop there.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And I think that there's a lot to me about the invisibility for caste privileged people in terms of caste versus the overwhelming burden of what it means to experience caste oppression for Dalit Americans and other caste oppressed Americans. And to me, I think one of the most significant examples of this is Kamala Harris.
Yes.
To me, I find it fascinating that we have a Brahmin senator, because she is a Brahmin, right? She is a Brahmin senator of the state of California during the time that this historic case is being heard, and she's not said a single statement. And I cannot imagine the reverse, because we know how she was during the during the presidential debates. She wiped the floor with Biden about his busing record, right? So if she can lean into and talk about her Tambram identity to get votes from the Indian Americans, she also needs to this time also speak to the justice that must be done on behalf of caste oppressed peoples in the state of California. And I'm saying this personally as someone who was Dalit American who grew up in California. This invisibility is such a crucial part of how this impunity continues. And Sam, I think this is a great moment to bring you into the conversation, because you actually went to IIT Mumbai, the same universities as the defendants at the heart of the complaint of Cisco. And I wanted to see if you could speak a little bit of your experience, how these casteist institutions create casteist networks that turn into hostile workplaces. And particularly since you've worked for multiple MNCs, including Cisco, your voice here would be very much, I think, appreciated. So please, Sam, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Mazi. I think thank you for giving me this opportunity and the brief introduction you have given. So I think I would like to start with my experience in IIT. I did my undergrad there in IIT, and if for the folks who don't know, when rank is getting into an IIT is a really big thing. First thing is, as per my knowledge, even today, the number of seats which are reserved for the oppressed caste people, for the Dalits, are not actually 100% filled. Even today, if I'm not wrong, I checked 3 years ago, I think in 2018, definitely it was not yet filled. So the seats which were even marked by the government for the filling are also not getting filled. So that is the state we are after so many, 50 plus years. Second thing is, when the ranks are let out, the rank of a normal general category student is, brought as AIR 1, 2, 3, AIR meaning All India rank. So you are All India rank 1, All India rank 2. But for a scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe persons who are Dalits, their rank is separately taken, like you are a SC1, you are SC2 and things like that. That doesn't happen in any other place, and I don't see any need for it, because there are various other competitive exams happen where ranks are never, by their caste. Okay, so that kind of what happens, the impact it brings is, once you are enter into that, the age of 18, you are entering into this premier institutes expecting wonderful things and all, and then you are almost certain that, okay, I don't want to reveal my identity. If I reveal, probably it might hit me and all. So it doesn't even give an opportunity to you, because on the notice boards on the day one, your roll numbers along with your ranks are already there. So the guys who know, the seniors and all, who already know how to find the things and all, they actually go, and even before we know, they already know our caste, and they will start by already naming, okay, we know what is your rank, what you are, kind of thing, and then they start. So immediately we are already getting some kind of complex. So even in the students, they have various slangs which use to identify, just like, for example, the SC/ST students are either called as CATUs, which stands for category students. So within themselves, the upper caste folks, so in their code language, they will try to say, it took some time for me to understand, but yes, they say, oh boss, they will, in some language, they will say, oh, he's a CATU, he will give away, so that they will deal a little bit differently and all. So things like that, so which kind of indirectly impacts in some way, builds some inferiority complex, and various other impacts which has. So that happens, even during ragging period and later part too. And the second thing, in terms of IITs, what I have observed is, it's an autonomous university. and it's a relative grading. So if you have got a 3 out of 10, if the professor can give you, B, and the same for getting the same 3 marks because the question paper was very tough, somebody else probably he'll, wrote better or whatever, he might, give him A. Okay. And there is no checks and balances, because I know in my instance only, I have seen that, in one of the cases, the professor, I went and saw, it was just like he changed his grade right in front of me. Okay. So without anything. So that means he can do whatever it is, and there is no checks and balances. There are no, CST cells to see that, whether the institute is following all the government norms, which has been, put in place to protect this, Dalits. Okay, so I have never seen there is any, even if you see, even today, I think the representation of the SC/ST professors is almost practically nil. There will be hardly, not even 1% of the professors will be SC/STs. Okay, which means that for the students, they don't have a counseling person or a mentoring person, at least among their SC/STs, who gives them confidence, because their issues are different. They may understand them. So there are no cells, I think, if I know, definitely not during my time. Even now, I don't see it. So during my time, what I have observed, because there was no helpful systems and, no right perspective on approaching why, it is like everybody is saying you, oh, why you came here? This is not the place for you. Rather than they're trying to see, these are the premier institutes. If we try to bring diversity here, it is going to go to that topmost level. And, so rather than looking at that way, I saw the attitude was like this. So in my case, when I was studying itself, one of the, my same batchmate student in her second year, she actually self-immolated herself. So she burnt herself to death, because she was not getting that support. And then she was so much worried that she can't make it, and all people, even the girls, made her feel that she doesn't belong there and all. So if you go and search in Google, even now, death of merit, okay, you will see that a wonderful documentary was put together by one of my friends whom I knew, who was working on that. You will see they have actually created documentaries on the people who have committed suicide, the students in the premier institutes. So on an average, just in the premier institutes like IIT, AIMS, and IIMs and all, if you look at that only, 4 or 5 premier institutes, there are at least more than 1 suicides per year. Okay. And if you go and talk to any IIT professor or anybody, for them, student suicide is a non-issue. There are nothing put in place how to avoid that, how to make sure that these people will get more benefits and more helpful mentors and things like that. So, and it starts from the top, because there are no professors representation or nothing. Same thing happens in when they are dealing with the students. They more behave as if their students doesn't belong here, versus giving them a good platform to go to the next level. Okay. And because these IITs are the place from where people are recruited into MNCs and all, so the same group of people who have formed their own groups and all are actually going to MNCs, and they are becoming the C-suite people of the MNCs, especially in India. Even these days, most of those people are, even in US, you will see they are the taking the seats, chairs in in most of the US companies in US too. So what that leads to is, for them, the caste representation, the diversity of inclusion of including caste in it and all is a non-issue. So that same thing happens even if you go to any MNC in India, even today, you will take out their HR policies. In their HR policies, they will mention the same things which is mentioned here in US, that you cannot discriminate based on, color, race, or gender and all, but not caste. In India, the whole discrimination is, there is nothing but the caste. The root of everything you take in India is caste. Everybody knows that there are, Constitution of India has so, stringent laws which are made. But if you go to any MNCs, you take it, whether it is non-Indian MNC or any Indian-based MNCs, even in their HR policies, you will not see a form of discrimination, a form of discrimination, caste has mentioned as that. So that is what in the Cisco case also, if you have seen, one of the excuses the HR took is, no, in our forms of discrimination, we don't recognize caste. So that is not just in US, but that is also if you go to the same companies which are having in base, I bet not only Cisco, but even the Indian MNCs will not have the caste mentioned in their HR policies as a form of discrimination. And when they are doing this discussion about there is tons of money they are spending on bringing diversity and inclusion, you go and look at their policies, diversity and inclusion policies, you will see that caste is not even mentioned there. Forget about doing something. And the same thing happens in US too, because most of the US companies, if you see today, most of the IT companies I have worked so far have more than 50% of their workforce is either based in India, based in India, or even if it is in US only, most of their 50% of their workforce is basically Indians who are based in US or.
And Sam, if I could just interrupt you just for a second, because I want to break down you've spoken about a lot of issues, and I just want to make sure our audience is following, because not everyone who's on our thread is Indian. But I think a couple things which Sam mentioned, which I really want to emphasize, that is a thread through Ajantha's piece, is that we have these very casteist educational institutions that are creating casteist alumni networks. So, for example, in IIT Mumbai, a professor there was so casteist that 2 of his Dalit workers tried to commit suicide on his doorstep because he would not only not allow them to unionize, but he also would use caste slurs in their attacks. So this isn't just the case of hurt feelings, it's actually a case of structural discrimination, which has been documented, by Anu Kumar in Death of Merit, which I recommend everybody see. But I think, Sam, for people who are not Indian, when they come into these when they come into these tech companies, the thing that I think many people don't understand is how does the process, for example, of internal referral plus the evaluation and reprisals system uniquely set up a casteist hostile workplace? Because I think that's the piece that a lot of tech workers on the call would really love to know more about.
No, sure. I think I'll briefly touch there, Tanmoji. I think thank you for pointing that out. So I think one would wonder, okay, in India it happens, it might happen, but how can it happen in US, right? So I think one of the key things in the MNCs, I think most of the MNCs, not just the IT MNCs, the key thing is every year they have an appraisal system. Some of them have even, half yearly appraisal too, but most of them have an yearly appraisal system. So what, in that appraisal system, people are ranked, usually in the 5 categories, and top 5% go into the topmost rank, and then the second category and the third category and all. So the appraisal defines everything in the MNC. So your appraisal defines what promotion, whether you will get promotion or not. It defines if you are in India, it defines whether you can come to on-site. On-site is coming to US from India if you're working in India. And even it defines, what salary hikes you will get. It might even define, what advanced technology opportunities you will get. Like if you are having a better rating in appraisal, you will be given a better opportunity and things like that. So I will just give one example of it. In my case, in one of the instances, what happened, I went for a client meeting. Usually if you are in US, there are every quarter, there is a client who visits the company, and then he tries to take you out for, some kind of dinner, or, just he wants to, interact and give more confidence. So in one of those client meetings to one of the restaurants we have went, I was there, and my bosses were there who happened to be, Brahmins, and then the client who was, young and non-Indian and didn't know much about caste and all, but he was very curious to know about caste. He just threw a question saying, hey, I know that there is this caste system. I read in the internet in India, there are atrocities with that and all. And I have been trying to read more about it, but I was very curious to know how does the people in US think, what do they think about the caste? So the Brahman boss, he was he was explaining to that person saying, oh, in olden days, we had this caste system, which was so wonderful. The society was divided into, 4 chunks, and one chunk was completely focused on education. The other chunk was totally focusing on, barriers. So how to improve, to better fight with the enemies and things like that. The third chunk was completely focused on business. The fourth chunk were serving the society. So he was trying to give a good picture, saying that, yeah, only, later when Britishers came, they kind of tried to bring, infighting and all. And then I was like, I waited for 5 minutes, and after 5 minutes, like I couldn't probably, take it. So I just gave my perspective in the discussion, saying that, look, it might be good if you are looking from an upper caste perspective, but from a lower caste perspective, if you see, they have been denied with everything. They have been denied access to education. They have been denied access to wealth, access to, employment, access to even public utilities and things like that. And that is the worst form of discrimination, even recognized by Constitution of India. Okay, so caste is a curse for the country. It has been recognized like that, and it is, it's not that Britishers has done anything for it. It has been in existence thousands of years, more than 2,000 years before. So then I think the discussion ended there. I could immediately see the reaction on my boss, saying that he thought that in some way I am trying to criticize and talking bad about India. In fact, when I was talking bad about caste, I was trying to give that my perspective to somebody who was very curious to know. So immediately I could see some change, but I thought it's just a discussion. He gave his perspective, I gave my perspective, and I came back. And this appraisal system, which I talked about, unfortunately for me, within 1 month after that discussion, there was this appraisal which was happening for everybody. So in the previous year, I was in the same place and everything, and I was in the topmost rating. I was in the top 5% of the employees. But this time in the appraisal rating, immediately after this, I could see some changes, even after that meeting, in our daily talks and things like that. But I thought it's like normal and things like that. But in the appraisal system, I thought, at the max, I might get 1 rank below, but I went 2 levels below. It was like surprising to me. I couldn't believe it. And because appraisal systems usually not one person, there are more than one person in the group who decide what is appraisal. So I tried to go to other managers and also try to ask him what happened. I never expected this. So the other managers also gave me feedback. Yeah, we also actually don't think you belong here. But somehow, this person was very insistent. He was very forceful in bringing that point that you should be put in this. So that was like shocking to me. So I see now, that was the first step which started impacting me. That's how, so in the appraisal system, I got impacted. And within 1 month after the appraisal came out, the manager comes and tells to me, look, there is some work which has come in offshore. So now you need to be in offshore. We need you very, desperately in offshore. So offshore meaning go back to India. So they were asking me from US to go back to India. For me, I was like the topmost employee just a few days before, and I was planning to stay here for another 2 years, and that is what everybody was, giving me clues about. So I planned like that because I had, kids at that time. Going back to India means like your kids' education will get impacted. Because in India, if you go, you have to study local language. So for the kids who have lost touch with local language, again, to study local language becomes very, very difficult. So I was very keen to be in US. So anyways, after 1 month, they asked me to go. So I had to go back to India. And because I was doing good, I was always a great employee. So before going, I got an opportunity from other company, and then I went back to India. And within 3 months, I came back to US with the new company. Some people ask me, okay, if HR has not done, behaved properly with you, if you think those guys didn't rate you well, why didn't you go to HR? So for me, coming back to US was very important because my kids' education was there and everything was there. And I knew that I cannot literally prove, but this was because of the caste angle or the caste discussion we had. I never bothered much, and then I came back. Okay, so that is one of the experiences which I had, and there are multiple instances like that. Yeah.
And I think what Sam is saying is really important, again, for people who are audience members to understand the pressure of what it means to be a caste oppressed worker in these environments means that, you know, you might be in a hostile workplace, but you have an HR that doesn't understand you. And the stakes are so much higher because it's not just that you would lose your job, you would lose your status in the United States. And we're going to be digging into that more with some of our other speakers. But Sam, I really want to thank you for sharing those pieces, because I think the consequences are so dire. And just for people to know, like after the Cisco case, Equality Labs got close to 300 similar complaints, like through our rapid response anonymized channel. And the thing that I thought was so disturbing about it was that, you know, we had major complaints from Facebook, Google, Microsoft, IBM, Cisco, Amazon, Dell, Twitter, Uber, Hewlett Packard, Apple, Deloitte, Netflix, Salesforce, Lyft, Zoom, Dropbox, and Quora. Those were all companies. And at the top 3 companies, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, we had 33 complaints at Facebook, 20 complaints at Google, and 18 at Microsoft. So this is a very large structural problem. And it's one of the reasons why we've been mobilizing for caste as a protected category for several months now. And in fact, we have a petition that you can find in our Facebook comments where we're working to get 10,000 signatures. And it's really about adding caste as a protected category throughout all American institutions. So we encourage people to sign that petition, but also we have a survey of caste tech workers and caste. And similar to our Caste in the United States survey, we're asking all tech workers who are interested to just fill it out. It'll only take probably 5 to 10 minutes at the most, but we want to be able to create another data set to help the workers at these companies because it is severe. So Maya, I would love to bring your voice into this as well, because I know that there have been many aspects to caste and gender when we've been looking at some of the complaints that we've received from Dalit women engineers, and you have been a leading Dalit feminist technologist in our community for many, many years. And I'm just wondering, would you mind sharing your experience and also how you see the dimensions of caste and gender within these tech workplaces?
Yeah, sure, T. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. And as Ajanta and Sam have already pointed out how caste operates in education and then how it percolates it into the hiring process. So even if we overcome the nepotism in the recruitment process of the caste nepotism in the recruitment process, and still get a job, the caste discrimination still follows us like a shadow. And because there are so many Indians in tech workspaces, and specifically this becomes more highlighted when you are a woman working in the tech workspace. I can give you an example. I previously had colleagues, Indian colleagues, who would keep asking me to join for their pujas or ceremonies at their house. And I would just not go or show up. And they would be very surprised that how come a woman is not showing up for pujas or ceremonies. Because, you know, by default, women are supposed to be more religious and are supposed to show up for these ceremonies, right? And then one day there was a colleague who came and, you know, started poking and asking me lots of questions. After a few times I did not visit her. And then I politely told her that, you know, I don't believe in rituals as much because I'm a Buddhist. And suddenly her comment was, oh, I have not met anyone who is a born Buddhist. So just to give you a contextual perspective, people in India got converted to Buddhism who were previously from oppressed caste, got converted to Buddhism majorly on October 14, 1956 by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. So there were millions of people who got converted. And so that so she was indirectly trying to point out that I came from an oppressed community, and the way she looked at me itself, she gave me a grin, and then she went off. But slowly I could see that there was a sense of seclusion. They would not, she would not say hi, and not just her, but my other Indian colleagues also did the same thing. They would not sit with me during lunch, which used to happen earlier, and then they would not talk to me as much, and things like that. So there is a sense of seclusion that is created just because of caste, and also mainly it gets highlighted in these discussions because of my gender. And the worst of all was when I had an Indian manager, and he knew what my caste was. So here, the gender dynamics operated very differently, specifically because he was a man from a dominant caste, and I was a woman from an oppressed caste. So he wanted to dominate me as much as possible, and it showed up during meetings. uh, he would be it showed up during our personal conversations as well, but it mainly showed up during meetings. He would, whenever I gave my suggestions, he would act or pretend as if he hasn't heard anything, or he would be very, very dismissive, or just oppose whatever I was talking. And this was so obvious that something is going on, that my non-Indian colleagues started to notice, and they started to back me up with my suggestions because they were valid, and they started to help me implement them. And this really hurt his ego per se, and he grew increasingly frustrated. And one day he said to me, he asked me not to touch a new tool because I was ill-fated. So I mean, not touching is one of the it was a direct reference to me being from an untouchable background. And how I could just remember how my ancestors were supposed to not touch things just because they were considered bad luck, and even their shadow was considered bad luck. So there was a whole context, there is a whole context of untouchability behind that one simple statement. At that point of time, I was just dumbfounded by his comments, because I never thought that after getting educated in US, and after achieving whatever I have achieved irrespective of caste would manifest to me in this way in US in a tech company. And these kind of seclusions, these kind of comments from managers have a lot of mental impact on the people from oppressed community. So it's very important to address this, because as soon as I felt I had a better opportunity, at the first chance I left that job. So this sort of discrimination not just affects the employees who are from oppressed communities, but it also affects the companies. And since HR doesn't have caste literacy, and since caste is not a protected category, it is very hard for us to bring up these issues to HR and to explain them, specifically if it's a non-Indian HR. So, but what I want to convey is, because of this oppression and seclusion that we face, we want to leave this kind of environment, and because of this, there is an attrition in companies, and they lose a lot of time and money in the talent and their rehiring and training process for the same job. And what is even more important is, and this it's even more important not to lose Dalit employees, is because the next billion users that are going to come are going to be majorly from marginalized communities, and mainly Dalits. And Dalits themselves are the best representative of their own problems and solutions that technological solutions can provide. So if you lose Dalit employees, you are not just losing one employee, but you are losing a big market space as well. So what I want to say is, it's in the interest of tech industry to have caste as a protected category for themselves.
Yeah, and Maya, I just want to emphasize some of the things that you mentioned for folks that, are really beginning to grapple with this in their worker organizing, is that the context is so critical, and this is the context that HR doesn't get. Like, I feel like if you were to explain to HR, oh, my managers call me ill-fated, they'd be like, so, he just said that you had a bad luck day, right? What they don't know is that ill-fated, bad luck, inauspiciousness is actually what has been connected to our caste. And it was so funny. I remember talking to another worker who wasn't actually in tech at all. They worked on an assembly line in California. And I asked him, like, well, why don't you report this case? And he said, they can't even find India on the map. Do you think they're going to sit down with me and do a history lesson about caste to help me? And then on top of that, in many of our IT workers, they also have to deal with the H-1B problem. Because again, it's not just about losing your work, it's losing your status. And I think that really has been one of the reasons why a lot of people that reported in our rapid response channel said that they were never, like in all of the cases, like we had close to 300 cases, nobody reported to HR. Not a single person, because of the H-1B. So this is a really critical thing that I want us to get into. And Sareeta, I think this is a great time for you to kind of hop into this conversation. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit, because even though people know that little acronym, I don't think they understand where it fits in terms of the labor politics of tech, and also how you see it in terms of Indian organizers across multiple institutions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Teinmuri. It's an honor to share the this virtual stage with you, Ajanta, Sam, Maya, and Anil coming up after me. So I'm going to give you a very quick history lesson. We do need a history lesson on India, where it is on the map, untouchability and caste oppression. We need a history lesson on elite education and how it produces these casteist companies internationally, transnationally. But there's also something to be learned about what this thing is, the H-1B visa. So the H-1B visa really is a device to control a labor force. And what it provides to companies is incredible flexibility. So in other words, rather than having to hire full-time employees, the H-1B visa allows multinational companies to move labor to different sites of employment pretty much at will, to employ them without benefits, and then to either move them to a different site or simply cancel their contracts once their work is finished. And because of the fact that the H-1B visa is primarily about creating a flexible labor force, we can sort of think of it as the original gig worker legislation. The H-1B visa actually begins way back in 1952 through the Immigration and Nationality Act. There was an initial H-1A visa that was for nurses. And then the H-1B visa is a sort of spin-off of the H-1A visa created in 1990. And so since that time, the H-1B visa is used to get short-term work and short-term workers to work on specific jobs for a limited contract, and then to move them on to different sites, as I mentioned. The other crucial thing to know about the H-1B visa is the spousal visa, the H-4, which many tech workers use to bring their spouses with them, but those spouses are mostly not allowed to work. There's have been a lot of changes to the legislation around H-4s, but mostly they're not allowed to work. So once again, this is an intersectional issue in which mostly women who come on these work visas cannot enter the labor force, and it opens up a vast area for domestic abuse, among other things. And it also creates an incredible pressure to maintain all of the caste networks that Sam and Ajanta already described in order to hedge one's bets and work within the system of constantly changing labor. So I'm not going to talk for too much longer, but a few things to note about the H-1B visa. It's being reformed and debated over all the time. It is by far the largest visa category for workers to enter the United States. There are quotas for the regularization of that visa into green cards that are highly contested. And also the last round of reforms in June 2018 around the H-1B visa was that anyone whose H-1B visa extension was rejected would be deported from the United States. So you can see there that it's also a very, very politicized issue in the context of larger US immigration politics. And I'll get to that at the end of my brief talk. So what are the effects of the H-1B visa system on caste and caste in tech? I'd like to talk really about 4 of them. The first one is about the pool of workers that moves from India to the United States. The H-1B visa is for skilled workers. And because of all the reasons that we have laid out already, those high-tech engineering jobs are already dominated by Savarna, upper caste, dominant caste individuals. And so we see this transfer over through the H-1B system of those very individuals who have come up through casteist, oppressive, social and educational institutions, and they make up the majority of workers in the United States. Secondly, another effect is the quashing of dissent. So as Dainmori, you were mentioning before, a complaint to a manager or an HR person, let's say there was an enlightened one, is extremely risky because one's visa status, one's right to remain in the United States is entirely tied up with employment. It's a perfect match. The moment that you lose your employment, you no longer have a right to reside in the United States. So therefore, most H-1B visa holders are extremely reluctant to speak up about workplace violations or harassment. And that is only doubled when it comes to Dalit or oppressed caste workers. In other words, they are very reluctant to speak up because in fact, you could lose your ability to stay in the US. A second point of quashing dissent is actually the way that the visa category can be used as a cudgel for caste oppression itself. So we heard a story from Sam and Maya about their own experiences with their bosses and managers. This comes up very frequently. There are stories that I have also heard of caste oppressed people speaking up for their rights. And then at the moment in which their position was meant to be converted to a permanent position, that was denied without any reason or recourse. Okay? It's also important to note that only half of all H-1B visa holders ever have their status converted to permanent residency. So while at the one hand, there's 2 effects of this. While on the one hand, all the elite oppressing caste, dominant caste people move up into increasing levels of power in management and in, as Sam said, in the C-suites. On the other hand, there's a 50-50 chance that your visa won't be converted. So once again, caste can become, the H-1B status can become a cudgel to harass people based on their caste. The third thing that I want to say is that the H-1B system has a lot of social effects. We usually think about it as an economic tool, and it is that, but it also it multiplies all the social effects of caste exclusion and isolation that Maya was speaking to, because in fact, all of these H-1B workers are very heavily reliant on their own social networks as a backstop or a safety mechanism. So the price to be paid for being excluded or speaking out and then being excluded is extremely high. It means that if you're suddenly let go or your contract expires, you do not have that network of people to rely on to help you find another position, or maybe find a position for your spouse who's working on the H-4 visa. if you're suddenly moved to a new site, right, as Sam was telling us, either you're asked to go offshore, or there are cases when people working for major multinationals were suddenly moved to Vancouver. Again, you're without that social network. So in many ways, the visa system is intensifying already extant, as everyone has been mentioning, very old caste exclusionary practices within this group of transnational highly educated technical workers. And then the last thing I want to say on the H-1B visa, which is sometimes hard for those who aren't as familiar with how caste operates, is that it creates these very interesting paradoxes and anomalies. So at the same time, the H-1B visa becomes a lightning rod for anti-immigrant organizing. And there are many nativist groups who really, really like to take the H-1B visa as one of their main things that they fight against. At the same time that that's happening, the category itself completely hides caste oppression because of the fact that people are afraid to speak up, and because of the fact that the H-1B visa category is seen as a way to move labor around at will, and there's not really very much care taken to understand and work on the conditions under which H-1B workers are working. And that's intensified by the fact that those who are regularized and can move up the ranks buy into and play into the model of meritocracy and individualized success that is also a part of the hidden apparatus of elite caste status. So Maureen, you also asked me to just mention a little bit what worker organizing can do vis-a-vis this question. And I think for me, there are 2 or 3 really big and main areas. One is the big project of organizing within companies across visa status. Historically, groups have not done a very good job with that. To find out ways to organize with contingent status workers that do not put them in harm's way. So Temori, as you just mentioned, the Equality Lab anonymous survey is a great tool in that respect, because it's actually surfacing things that people do not feel comfortable speaking up about, even within worker organizing groups and circles. Another thing that I think is really important when it comes to what worker organizers can do is to recognize that all the issues they are interested in, whether it be race or caste, have a visa. They have an immigration and a labor dimension to them, and to put those front and center in organizing work. And then the third thing I will mention are the things that everyone has already been talking about, which is to really focus on recruitment and making caste a protected category with a push from the inside of these tech companies, from worker organizers that are trying to include H-1B visa holders and oppressed caste individuals, Dalit individuals within their organizing structures.
Thank you, Sareeta, for that. And it's just a reminder that I think also for people that are trying to grapple with this issue, that it has to be an inside and outside issue, meaning that the community is here asking for this demand and respite, but there are many of us who are part of these companies. And I think that being able to let other folks know that are organizing around other issues like racism or gender-based violence, that caste is a critical category to loop into your intersectional analysis of how your company's social responsibility, both to its workers and in terms of the product that it's building. But that also, it starts with a risk assessment and discrete ways where people can share what they're most afraid of. And as an organization that works with caste oppressed and Dalit Americans all across the United States, we have had to innovate ways for anonymity and ways for there to be discrete back channels, because our community cannot participate in the same way that other communities can, not just because of visas, but also because of the severe reprisal we face from other caste privileged communities. And I know, like for myself, I have faced rape and death threats and other sorts of slurs just for being out as a Dalit American. I know that another one of our colleagues who spoke about the social isolation, that as a young mother and someone who works in the industry, she would prefer to not hang out with anybody and no Indians, simply because if she's found out, it could have ramifications for her and her husband's profession. So they only hang out with Americans, and they don't have access to some of the things that you need from your immigrant networks of support. So it's this double isolation that really leads to a level of psychosocial impact that's actually imminently changeable and imminently mitigatable if we actually talk about the problem, collect data about it, and add it as a protected class. And Anil, I think, oh, sorry, Sareeta, did you want to
Can I just add one last thing? Sorry that
yes, you can.
Thank you, reminded me of. One last thing I wanted to say that's really about the tech industry and why privileged caste communities can kind of get away and believing in their own meritocracy and becoming very insular and relying on these social networks. One is the H-1B, a contingent labor issue that I was talking about. But another is actually about the behavior of the tech companies themselves that completely support them in that way of seeing the world and thinking. So all the ways in which all the companies you mentioned, let's just take Facebook, support a regime in India and do very, very little to quash the horrific anti-Dalit messages that are being spread across that platform. I think that has also an intensifying and multiplier effect on the ability of the upper caste, dominant caste Indians who work for those companies to believe in their own exceptionalism and their own merit.
And this is a really good point, and I think, Anil, I'd love to bring you in, is that, you know, in many ways, biased workplaces create biased products. And I think that even if your journey is not to be that person who's like the representative of social justice causes, I think I want to really remind people what Maya said. It is bad business to be casteist in the Indian and South Asian market, particularly when the next set of users that represent the next billion users coming online are actually coming from caste oppressed peoples. And I think one thing for people to know is that 1 in 4 people in the world are South Asian, 1 in 6 are Indian. And so much of the future of the internet is not going to be decided in Silicon Valley or in North America. It's going to be in our homelands of our region of the world. And to enter that market without any sort of competencies related to caste or have firm understandings of what it means to protect the classes from this people means you actually have the wrong people creating your product. And if you want to solve for those people, you actually need to have designers and engineers and UX folks that come from those backgrounds, but they're not going to stay at your company if when they get there, they're dealing with slurs and other sorts of casteist nonsense. So it's just shitty business sense on top of all of the other moral arguments that we've made here. And Anil, if I've ever met anybody who can make the argument that it's shitty business sense and get your moral act together, it's you. And so I'm wondering like what you would say to people who are in venture capital or people who are in the management or C-suite. What is their responsibility in this moment right now?
Sure. So I first of all, thank you for that setup. But I want to step back a bit and first be like, I am never compromising on the moral argument is
Absolutely.
why we do the right thing. You know, I'm never trying to justify that through the economic argument. I just think it's nice that the economic argument also supports the moral argument. Like it's good that we have
Absolutely.
both, you know, both of those things are headed the same direction. And we can actually even, before we start talking about our communities, we can look at why are American tech companies building platforms that, for example, enable white supremacy when the majority of their coming user base of everybody in all the audiences they want to reach are going to be targeted by them. Why is that happening? And it actually, it ends up being a lot of the same patterns. These things replicate across communities, across the world, across different audiences. And I think a really, really useful framework that so many of you already brought up is about risk, right? Who is vulnerable, who's at risk, and also what risk do the people with power feel like they're experiencing or feel like is going to be destabilizing their ability to hold on to that power? Because we are talking about shifting power, right? And so I want to sort of acknowledge, I am as privileged as it gets, whether it is caste or gender or all the other aspects. So I'm grateful to even get the chance to speak in these conversations because I'm, if anything, overrepresented here. But what I can offer is a glimpse into what I have seen being in boardrooms and in rooms with venture capitalists that I was either, trying to pitch and fundraise with, or even just knowing them. And, I think one of the most important starting points is they have received a myth that they are starting from. Meritocracy is foundational to that myth. They have received a myth of the sort of techno-solutionism, and that tech can just solve all these problems and doesn't carry with it the past, unjust systems. It doesn't reproduce the systems that it was born out of, right? Those myths are foundational, and they impact every community they serve. And then we see how poisonous they are for the communities we're all part of, right? And the thing I would say, like, I try to be, there are people who are bad actors, and I don't excuse that, but I try to, for people who don't know they're being bad actors, how do we sort of be maximally empathetic of how do people who think they're being good, who think they're doing right, do something harmful? Because I've been one, right? I grew up not having a fluency in these issues. I still have a lot to learn. And so when did I replicate harmful structures in societies? Why did I do it, right? And then others who are just on that same path, well, how did they get there? And one of the things I see is they start from, I can't emphasize this enough, even the most powerful caste privileged people in the industry who are of any South Asian descent still see themselves as completely precarious in a white dominated tech industry, right? Myself included. Like, I look at a moment where, right now, he just got arrested, Steve Bannon, while, is sitting in the positions of most power in the White House, is saying there are too many South Asian CEOs in tech, and openly advocating, really, really virulently destructive and hateful policy and practices around all South Asian communities. And I don't expect it to be legible to a white supremacist what our contexts are. And so that's sort of the first part, which is that the most powerful caste privileged CEOs in tech still see themselves as they're the ones backed into a corner. They're vulnerable. So the idea that they are also replicating incredible harm towards people in their organizations, or enabling the people who report to them to be perpetuating these harmful systems, it is a leap. It has not occurred to them. It takes organizing, it takes education, it takes the data that all of you are gathering, it takes those facts to make the case. I actually do believe we can be persuasive. Like, I actually do believe that workers organizing can shift this. There are, unquestionably, like I said, there are bad actors. I'm not saying, oh, everybody just needs, if they get a spreadsheet, suddenly they'll see the light. Like, I don't think it's that simple, but I do want to emphasize that there is a huge component that is ignorance, unfamiliarity, illiteracy. And let's take away that excuse for them. Let's take away that part. And I think that's where I'm so galvanized by and inspired by the organizing that's happening, is I think we can take away at least the foundation that lies on their ignorance, because it is fully possible to grow up within caste privileged communities in America and not have legibility or visibility into the issues that people face as a result of caste in this country, because they are erased. They haven't been in media. They haven't been, and because people are so vulnerable, they can't raise it. Because I think about what H-1Bs do is they make it so that, even if they did nothing else, the fact that they make it impossible for there to be solidarity between different groups of workers to organize together has utility, right? Like, that, of course, is a thing that they're going to exploit. Now, the second part that also amplifies and reifies, we want to privilege these few institutions. We want to, frankly, from a most HR perspectives at large companies, they are not distinguishing on the basis of caste between their workers. Like, all of you are a problem. All of you having any complaints on the basis of something that we could see as an HR violation. Any of these things being registered as a protected class is a threat to us. So they see that universally as a challenge. So I think the optimism, the optimistic take is we absolutely must get caste recognized as a protected class in order to take advantage of the structures that exist there. And then the experienced, less optimistic take is they're going to see it as, here is another problem about this entire group of people, regardless of caste, because they're outside of it. And so that's the part I'm trying to think about. How do we take apart and amplify? And the most effective thing, organizing works, period. I think gathering data works, period. What I think about, like I said, having sat in those rooms, is how do we empower people who have been victimized on the basis of caste to be able to articulate what their experiences are in a way that will be legible to the positive parts of the systems of power, to the parts that actually can be manipulated towards justice, right? Because we will never get the bad actors to come along. Can we get the people who, I think there are like wildly caste privileged people in tech who have been part of perpetuating casteist systems who think of themselves as progressive advocates who care about justice. You know what I mean? They're like, I fight the good fight. I know what to say, but they're only fluent in their context. And so can we get them to actually see that the systems they've been perpetuating are a thing that they could be dismantling as opposed to reifying? And that comes from, I think the data are incredibly valuable. People's experiences, incredibly valuable. I think the more we can do to storytell is really, really powerful. The more we can do to just amplify, that does work. That does work. There will be board meetings where people say like, I don't understand caste, but I read this report. And it says there is violence and oppression happening in our organizations. And that's where the risk framework is really powerful. That is a thing that will, a publicly traded company saying my workers are at risk of violence and I'm going to be on the hook for it, that will change things. That changes things. And they don't have to know all the details. They don't have to know all the context. They only need to know that part. And so that's like the unifying concept that I come to, which is that the thing we can be most powerful on of everybody working across the different disciplines, whether it's worker organizing or academia and research or media and you know, amplification, like all these different disciplines can come together around elevating the voices of people that have been affected, the people who are brave enough to speak up, and then shaping them into stories that are saying these organizations are being put at risk by the people perpetuating caste bias in the institution, right? They are the problem. That's the problem. Now, do you want to root it out? Now, they're going to be Pollyannas. They're going to be optimistic. Oh, you know, we can give them a PowerPoint and train them on inclusion, and that'll solve it. Now, obviously, it's not going to get them there. Like, we can't keep them off the hook of the usual sort of half remedies that they go to. But identifying, naming it, and giving it a structure they can recognize, which is that your organization is going to be called out for the harm that it is perpetuating if you don't anticipate and react to this set of specific concerns, and then to say, and it's legible to a way that you can organize, you can understand. It is something that resembles oppressions that you've had to deal with in your workplace before. It is some, you know, it's not exactly analogous. Obviously, we're never going to be directly analogous to, you know, a Black person's experience to you know, any other person who's marginalized, but to sort of say it is a format, it is a, well, I think oppressive movements around the world learn from each other. It is a structure that you can learn from and sort of say, you're going to face the same issues you would have with any other community in your company being structurally oppressed if you don't handle this risk. And that is a thing that all other stuff aside, the capital class can understand. Because they don't know. There are not venture capitalists that are talking to, and it is 100% true, the other venture partners at their firms, the other investors at their firms did go to an IIT. They are the people who are privileged. They think they got there through merit and have never interrogated it, because why would they? And so they're like, I made it into the room. I feel like I overcame a system biased against me. And so they can't talk to their coworker and say, hey, what do you know about this? Because they don't know anything. In the most charitable case. In the worst case, they do know everything and they're doing it on purpose. But like in the most charitable case, they don't know enough to say. So then to sort of say, they can't talk to their coworker and have them be the representative of everybody, you know, of a community of 1.5 billion people. And instead, where are they going to go and have information they can treat as reliable? I think, you know, the work that's already happened from Equality Labs and other organizations has given it a format that they can process, that they can fit into their system and actually affect change. Not so digestible that they're like, we don't change anything, we just understand it and fold it in. But I think it sort of challenges in a useful way. So that's my hope. And I think that's the thing to focus on from the working within structures standpoint. Now, you can never solve the problem entirely by working within the systems. Like I'm not advocating that. But I do think there are organizations where, given the chance, given the space, and given the context, they would try to make things more just. And for those organizations, the more we can resemble systems that have actually made positive change, the more they're going to understand it. And so we draw analogies to other communities. You know, you don't want to exploit those connections, but I mean, to be able to make it legible, I think that's powerful. And then people's stories. I mean, the thing that changes, that I've seen it in like I said, in boardrooms and board meetings. And they say, well, this person said this, and they sound like it's so plain, it's so straightforward, it's so understandable. Those things do have impact, and I'm always surprised by that, because I have every reason to be cynical about the people in those rooms, you know. But human empathy is a powerful thing, and so, you know, I think I've even just, you know, Sam, the story you just shared, like those stories have so much power. The more we can do to make those legible to people who know nothing of our context, and to realize that we have people who look like us who know nothing of our context, I think that's a huge opportunity, and I'm excited about like these first steps that have been taken.
And I think it's very important for people to know is that people are organizing. We already have multiple working groups across many Silicon Valley tech companies who are really eager to take on caste as a protected category. And some of our asks that we've put out in our petition, which again is in the Facebook comments, is that we're asking not only for caste to be a protected category, but for companies that have a severe amount of caste discrimination happening to consider doing an audit, and an audit of caste and religious bias, because casteist workplaces not only impact, you know, Dalit Americans, but it also impacts other caste oppressed space, like South Asian Muslims, South Asian Christians, and South Asians, Buddhists, and Sikhs. And so an audit, once we use an audit, we're able to see the scope of the scale of the problem, and then we can start to work on it. And we know that audits work because of, you know, examples of how Color of Change worked with Airbnb, that getting a sense of the scope and scale really means everything. And that was really lifted and really driven by workers. And so I want to just emphasize, caste as a protected category, you know, having an audit of caste and religious bias, and then thinking about positive forms of supporting caste oppressed employees once they get into the workplace, so that it's not just about success, but not just about access, but it's also about success. So I think other diversity and inclusion measures for other communities have included scholarships, specialized internships, coaching, and the support for workers, not just to come into the to be part of the larger worker process, but to have a pathway into growth in the company as management and other processes. So I really think that this really starts at its heart as a workers issue. And we're very lucky to have Chewy here with Googlers Against Racism. And Chewy, I just wanted to give you like a short, quick minute to kind of talk a little bit about your work, because I think that there's a lot of how caste works in a very similar way to racial bias. And for folks that want to know more about caste and look at that, comparison, I really recommend Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste and Our Discontents, because it's a great comparative, easy read between these two systems, and also lays a lot on the ground for people that are trying to organize about this on our companies. So Chewy, do you want to just like let folks know who you are and a little bit about some of the organizing before we go into questions?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, my name's Chewy Shah. I've been working at Google for about 7 years, and I'm one of the people who've been organizing Googlers Against Racism over the past few months, where we've been sensing that Google over the last couple of years has really turned its back on listening to the cries of its workers, and it's time for us to really start trying to organize ourselves and get ourselves to support each other in each of the different efforts that we're doing to really create meaningful changes to systemic racism and systemic issues of discrimination and exclusion that happen throughout our company and throughout the industry.
Wonderful. Oh,
and I also want to thank all of you for all of the information that you've given so far. Like for me, it was really enlightening just to kind of hear of how it is so set up as a situation where there's so many people who are so afraid to ask for help, and to hear that there are so many people like Google who have stories to tell but feel like they can't speak to HR. Like, it connects so much with me growing up as a Black kid in the South, of what it does to you when you don't feel like it's safe to ask for help, and you feel like you could be attacked, whether it's financially, psychologically, or physically. Like the idea that you'll be kicked out of the country that you're in just because you ask for help, that's horrifying to me. And it seems really important to me that we do everything we can to reverse that pattern within our industry.
And it's also so important, I think, because there's been a lot of Black and Dalit material solidarities, like through the course of both Black liberation struggles and Dalit liberation struggles. And I think this is a really great place to create alignment, because the thing that is so wild about these companies failing their duty of care when it comes to caste is that, again, the Cisco case is not just significant about what it would do in California, but almost all of these major companies, including Google, have huge localized offices in India. And whatever their excuses, and Sundar Pichai, who is a Brahmin, doesn't really have an excuse for saying he doesn't know what caste is. Whatever their excuses for not doing their duty of care in the United States, they have no excuse in India, where it is the rule of law to understand and protect caste oppressed peoples. But again, I think that what you said, Chui, which is like so poignant, is that when you are an oppressed community where all of your oppressors are in institutions of power, you can have a law, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be implemented, right? And I think that's why it was so significant for so many Dalits to see this case come forward, because we were asking ourselves, why was the state of California able to do what the government of India refused to do, when we are seeing so many casteist experiences in the localized offices offshore in India as well? And so I think that we really need to, again, take it back down to basics and talk about, what does this mean as a workers' issue, and begin to have the backdoor conversations that allow people to see each other and talk through risk, and then figure out ways that we can create public solidarities that make sense. So we really appreciate the solidarity, and also you joining us and the many Googlers who are joining us online, because I think it's really powerful when we start to learn each other through stories. These stories become a bridge then into power. So thank you so much. I also think I want to flag, because we've got some questions coming in from our audiences. And there's one question, which is a very practical question, which is, I want to start organizing in my company. What does this look like? And I would ask that if anybody who is listening is really thinking about starting this conversation with HR, just know that you're not alone. And one of the things I really recommend is that you reach out to Equality Labs, and we'll put an email that you can follow up on in the comments. But you can find us online and on social media, because we have a toolkit that can help you bring this conversation forward. Because as Anil mentioned, like, if you go into an HR with this conversation without context and without data, you're like going to be their least priority. You're already going to be their least priority because you're kind of a squeaky wheel, right? But what we want you to do is to be able to help make the most persuasive case. And we have both the stories, the data, and also the business arguments for why this should happen. But we're also very critically connected to other workers that work on similar or parallel issues. So you don't have to feel like you're alone while you're doing it. So, reach out to us, read the Caste in the United States report, and also push both the survey and the petition, like in your workers' forums and with other people, because often those become talking points with other allies who will reach out and hear from you about this work. Some other questions that I saw is, so this was a question, and I was going to ask this to Ajantha and Sareeta and Sam and Maya. There's a question here, is, are there industries or sectors that actively recruit engineers or scientists from caste oppressed communities? I have not heard that. I'm curious if you guys have heard that.
There's so much silence, right?
Exactly.
No.
Exactly. Sam, did you want to respond to that too?
Yeah, I too have never heard that any
Yeah.
industry specifically recruits. But one thing I want to point out, it might be relevant, is if you take the data of the scavengers, okay, which is actually a forced labor, which the government of India has been promising, but never actually formally banning the scavengers. The scavengers are the one who do all the shift lifting, all the work of cleaning of the roads or cleaning of the shit of the people and all. There are in many places in India, even today, you have to actually, lift the shit with your bare hands. Okay, you don't have the systems, sophisticated systems or sophisticated machines to do that. So if you take that, literally almost 100% of that is the Dalits. It's like a forced labor kind of thing, but they are all Dalits. So a lot of fights have been, a lot of protests and a lot of awareness has been created to at least give them the right tools, right machinery and all, so that they don't have to go into shitholes. And every year several people are dying just because they have to enter into those shitholes or do things with bare hands. So that is exclusively given to the Dalits. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is, even there where there is money making, if there is a government contract which is given to clean roads or anything, usually the upper caste, particularly the Brahmins, they get the contract. So the money is still in their hand, but the actual work is done by the sanitation and by the Dalits who are there on the ground. So that is how it works. So wherever there is money, the money is going to the upper caste because he is the one who gets the contract and everything. But the actual work of anything which is considered traditionally as polluting to, or which is almost inhuman, is being done by Dalits even till today.
Yeah. Ajantha, did you want to answer that question?
I mean, I just want to echo what Sam said, which is that, if you look at who does the most precarious and dangerous work in India till today, right, it is the oppressed castes, right? So the caste stratification of labor, which is also associated to a caste stratification of value, right, is alive and well. And as Sam said, it even plays out in the state sector, right, where caste becomes a basis for patterns of state employment. And so, in the sort of public sector, you can see this through the operations of the state and how people are recruited to particular kinds of employment. In the private sector, you look at agrarian bondage, right? There are still forms of agrarian bondage that persist, where you have Dalits who have inherited, right, the status as bonded laborers and continue to do work which gives them sort of very little protection, right? So, the other thing I'll say is, if you look within engineering, the people who do the core engineering jobs, right? The ones where, people who are actually building the roads, doing the work that we typically associate with engineering, these are not the graduates of elite institutions like the IITs, right? These are the graduates of lower tier engineering and technical schools, which are typically populated by oppressed castes, right? So, even if upper castes, dominant castes, sort of claim to be sort of representative of the nation, the actual nation builders in a concrete sense are the oppressed castes.
And I do want to also flag, like, for people that aren't Indian or South Asian that are hearing terms like caste oppressed, caste privilege, lower caste, upper caste, you might be like, I don't even know what to say. And I said, and I think that one of the things I want to encourage people is that it's always new when you learn a structure of oppression. And I think usually you can find the right guardrails when you just talk to an oppressed person from that community, and they'll guide you into that conversation. But I bring that up also in terms of Ajantha's conversation, is that it's very tricky oftentimes to talk about caste, because we often get very looped into only looking at the community that is facing the most of the consequences. So caste will be equated with Dalit, and we only talk about, oh, this shitty thing is happening here, oh, this level of structural exclusion is here. And nowhere on the table is the networks of privilege that benefit off the structural exploitation of oppressed peoples. And that is very much true with caste. So when we talk about this conversation, we not only need to talk about what do we need to do to protect caste oppressed people, but we also need dominant caste people or Savarna Americans. They need to do their work. That means they need to decenter themselves. That means they need to really learn about their histories and how they've been complicit with this violence. And very critically, they need to be able to give cover and give space for caste oppressed peoples to own this conversation and step forward. And as many of our panelists have spoken to, this is an intersectional issue. And in fact, it was Dalit feminist scholarship that actually first shine a light on this issue. And we need to have Dalit women as part of this conversation because, as Sareeta mentions, there are impacts with the H-4 visa. We see impacts related to gender-based violence. And very critically in the workplace, we have had numerous reports of Dalit women engineers who are facing sexual harassment and assault once their caste identities are found out. So I really want to explain, help people, understand this is a large problem. This town hall is the beginning of a conversation. And I know that we are over time, so we may not have enough space for more dialogue, but what I want to tell you is that we can continue this conversation in many spaces. So first, for people that want to get involved, please reach out to Equality Labs. We're a Dalit civil rights organization. We have feminist leadership, and we are in the process of doing a new caste and tech survey that will hopefully be able to give more data and more stories to this issue. So if you can forward that, that survey link, you'll see it in our comments. We also have a petition that we'd love for people to, share out because our goal is 10,000 signatures, and that will really help in terms of some of our negotiation processes. But also we have strong worker organizing that's going on. And I really want to shout out Antonio from Coworker, and for baby organizers or workers who are just getting involved, Coworker's platform has a great process in terms of how to think about organizing discreetly and how to work with other groups of workers who are building power around the multiple of issues, not just caste, but also around racial justice and gender-based discrimination. And Coworker, I think, could be a really great place to find power. But that said, before we close, I want to give each of the panelists 1 minute to kind of close us out. I know it's not ideal, but you guys have so much to say. We could each do a town hall with just each one of you, but I do want people to hear your voices before we close. So, if we could start with Maya, and then we can just go down the road.
Hey, so what I want to really convey is that it is in the best interest of tech industry itself to have caste as a protected category so that they also can benefit with the next billion users, and we also can benefit out of their products. Right now, the products are catered towards only privileged people, and the next billion users are coming from underprivileged background and mainly Dalits, so they have to make it, they have to cater towards our needs.
Great.
Thank you.
Sareeta?
Thank you. First of all, thank you everybody to the panelists for your amazing presentations. My last thought here is building on this question of how oppressed caste people fit within the tech industry. And I just wanted to say, just as the H-1B visa is a form of labor control, I would like everyone to think recursively all the way from the C-suite down to the call center, and to think about how on each of those levels, caste, gender, and race actually segment labor forces. And so that privilege is located throughout the entire system, and the entire system is in fact built upon the labor of those who have been silenced and unrecognized and unsupported within the industry.
Thank you. Anil?
Yeah, I think briefly, there's sort of two things. It absolutely is incumbent about all of us who have privilege and power to change our behaviors. And I think one of the most dramatic and exciting things is we're starting to see that change happen. And, you know, it's first baby steps. It's just a little bit of improvement, but it does come from people having had the courage to tell their stories and organize. It does work. I mean, I think it's so easy to lose faith. It is so easy to feel like these are insurmountable problems, and to think that it's, oh, you know, what can my voice do, or what can one story do? And the truth of it is, we see it's starting to have that impact. So I think just sort of staying with that and supporting each other can have even more impact than people might imagine.
Wonderful. Chewy?
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, just how, like, in the past few years, I feel like I'm starting to hear so many more of the stories of Indian Americans and the different struggles that are going on, that I feel like just throughout my life before were not part of any of the conversations. And so it's definitely encouraging that now voices are able to speak up, and being able to see that something like this project that you all are doing is actually starting to really make this scene is incredible to me. And I'm really excited to see all that we can do working in collaboration to make this a solidarity effort across the industry to really change things for the better.
Awesome. Yes, we are so excited too. And we want to just also give a special shout out to all the workers, Googlers that are here. We really feel your power and energy, and just want to thank you. Ajantha?
I think the one thing that I really hope is that sort of anti-caste activism in the US continues to be linked to India, right? So, I mean, we were talking about how in India there's constitutional recognition of caste oppression, and there are constitutional protections for caste oppressed people, but these also have their exempted spaces, and one is the private sector. Caste is not a protected category in the Indian private sector. So the knock-on effect of making caste a protected category here might be its extension in India to the private sector. So I think sort of uniting these struggles transnationally is going to be really, really important.
Yes, definitely. And I think this is actually why Maya and Sam and the work that, you know, we do as Ambedkarite organizations is some of that transnational link. Maya is here with Ambedkar Association of North America, and Sam is here as one of the founders of Ambedkar International Center. You know, all three of our organizations are part of transnational organizing related to the annihilation of caste for many years. And I think that's really has to be the foundation of this work, right? And so I think that those are some really powerful thoughts, Ajantha, that you shared, as well as all of our panelists shared, is that this town hall is really a call to action. We need a transnational movement to address caste as a protected category. We need audits of companies that are behaving badly. And, you know, one of those companies right now, which is in the news a lot, is Facebook, because of its bias. In fact, the bias of its top leader in South Asia, we are seeing enormous amounts of politically informed hate speech that's infecting hundreds of millions of people across South Asia. So bias creates crappy products, as well as fails its duty of care towards its workers. And that's why the other kind of follow-up from this town hall is really worker power and worker organizing. And we're so grateful for all of the workers that have joined us, and also for co-worker and Antonio, who has been like a light in this process in terms of really inspiring new workers to come and join and build those cross-race, cross-gender, cross-caste solidarities. So with that, we want to bring our town hall to a close, and we want to thank all of our sponsors, including Data and Society, Harvard Center for South Asian Studies, coworker.org, and the many different South Asian institutions and Dalit institutions that helped to make this event happen. We want to thank all of our panelists, as well as the Equality Lab staff like Sahana, Sharman, and Monica that have been the support for this to happen, as well as the captioning provided by Data and Society, which has allowed accessibility across our whole event. So thank you all, and for all of our listeners at home.
Tanmoji, if I can get 1 minute. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, let me just finish, Sam, and then I'll
Sorry.
begin.
Yeah, sure.
I really also want to thank all of our audience members who are listening in. We've had such an active participation thread. I know that not all of the comments are answered, but we'll make sure to be in relationship with you, particularly for folks who want to do organizing. Sam, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I'll get my 1 minute, but just wanted to.
Oh my God, Sam, I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
Sam, no, Sam, you please take the 1 minute.
No, thank you. No, sorry. First of all, I wanted to thank Tanmoji, to you for giving me this opportunity, and thank everyone who has attended today. I know it's difficult to give time, so I would like to thank everybody, who has made an attempt to, attend this meeting. Feel free to reach out offline too, as Ten mentioned. But one thing I want to leave out is, like, we are all part of this. We are all trying hard while we are doing other things to create a caste-free India and caste-free world. So thank you for supporting that. And whenever you get time, engage with your Indian colleagues to ask them about caste, because that is the starting point. If they say, Britishers created it, that's the wrong notion. If they acknowledge that, yes, caste is a monster and all, that's a starting point. So I would encourage people to engage wherever they, whenever they meet anybody from Indian community. I think to engage in that, that is one way of creating the awareness. So thank you for everybody's time to, to help us create a caste-free India and caste-free world. That's the bigger agenda we are having here. Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Sam. And of course, we could not end without your last minute. So I'm so sorry. Your name was hidden off my list, and so I just missed it. But I think that your words really are the words that we need to carry with us, which is we are here to be united to build a caste-free India and a caste-free world. And it begins with acknowledging the monster of what caste apartheid is, but that we have hope because we're building power collectively. So thank you for those words, Sam, and thank you all for participating. And Jay Beam and Jay Savitri, and till caste is done in our lifetime, we'll keep going. So thank you again. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Jai Bhim, Jai Savitri, bye.
Jai Bhim, Jai Savitri.
She said stay on, but